So, what did Jews believe when, at the time when Saul was growing up, before Jesus, in the first century BC and the first century AD? What did Jews believe at that time? I think that's very important for shaping Paul. So, we look at Genesis and Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy. We look at the Torah as this just book of rules. They did not at all. They saw it as God's story of a people. It was the story of the people of God. God had chosen them to be different from the world. They had maybe forgotten the part about being a light to all nations, but they knew that God had chosen them out of the world to be special, and they had failed. And so God had punished them and sent them into exile, and that was the Babylonian exile. And we read scripture and we see that they were returned to Jerusalem, at least some of them were, and the temple was rebuilt. But the Jews did not believe that their exile had ended. God had not returned to the temple. If you'll remember, in the tabernacle in the wilderness and the first temple, God's presence resided in the innermost sanctuary as a cloud. In the tabernacle wilderness, this cloud would lift and guide them through the wilderness, and when they settled again and rebuilt the tabernacle, that cloud would settle in the tabernacle, and so his presence was there in the tabernacle, and then the presence was in the temple. But after the Babylonian exile, after the return, God's presence did not return to the temple. So they believed they were still in exile. Another reason, an important reason, that they believed they were still in exile is they were still being ruled and oppressed by the Gentiles. They were not independent. God had not freed them from their oppression. So they believed that they were still in exile. Now, if they go back to Daniel's prediction, and he says it'll be 70 times 7 when God will return and end their exile, that's 490 years. That is happening. That is really close. It's sometimes somewhere in the near future. And so they believed that it was very important that they strictly follow Torah. And they did it joyfully. They did it zealously. It wasn't a burden. They were trying to be pure and follow God so that God would return. It's sort of a parallel situation of what they were experiencing in the wilderness, right before they're entering the promised land. This is when the story that you read in your assignment of Phineas occurs. They're in the wilderness, they're about to enter the promised land. And so they believed that they needed to protect the community of their idolatry and their immorality in order to receive the reward of the promised land. Now, I only had you read the part about Phineas, but in Numbers leading up to that, there's the story of Balaam's talking donkey. Well, Balaam had been hired by the Moabite king because these Israelites were a threat. They were about to take over his land. So he hires Balaam to curse them. And Balaam's donkey stops him from cursing them. And so he isn't going to get paid. So he comes up with this other means of cursing, if you will, the Israelites by sending in Moabite women and tempting them into immorality. And it works. And this one man, so they're the Israelites, or at least the zealous Israelites, are trying to protect the community's purity and not worship idols. And this one Israelite takes a Moabite woman in full view of everyone, in fact, in full view of Moses himself, and takes her into his tent to have relations. And that's just really just flaunting it really in their face. And Phineas is outraged, and he goes in with the stake and kills them both. Well, then he becomes a hero. He is held up as this example of protecting the community's purity. And it is the phrase is used of him that it is he is declared righteous. And this was a phrase that Saul and all the Israelites would have heard over and over as part of the Israelite story, because Abraham, by leaving Mesopotamia, by leaving his homeland, and believing God that he would become a nation, even though he was old, he believed, and it was declared that he was righteous. Now, this word righteous, it really, it doesn't mean like goody two shoes. It means that you have a very close, committed relationship. And in this case, the relationship is with God. So this is quite an honor. And so Phineas is honored by God because he has protected the community from immorality. N.T. Wright, one of my favorite or new favorite authors and scholars, writes that this is the defining moment of zeal. The plague that had been burdening them because of their immorality stopped immediately. And this hero was promised a perpetual personal relationship with God. His families would be priests forever. And if you if you search through Bible Gateway, it does become true. Phineas is mentioned over and over again as a priest, and his sons are priests, and he is a priest forever, reckoned to him as righteousness. So Phineas is put on the same level as Abraham in the story of Israel. God established a lasting, forever, unbroken covenant with Abraham, and now with Phineas. Phineas's zeal becomes a hallmark, a sign, an example of purity, of protecting Israel's purity.